Last week, anybody remember what the topic was in general?
Talks about the universe.
The universe. Pretty big topic, literally. So, got the questions from last week. I didn't get to run over them before we ended, but hopefully you got a chance to look at them and think about them a little bit. So, first question. When the Big Bang Theory, we talked about this last week, was first proposed, it was met with a lot of theological backlash from atheists. Now, why do you think that is? And if you want me to clarify a little bit, I can. Why would atheists be opposed to the Big Bang Theory?
It suggested a point of origin.
Ah, okay. Remember we talked last week
I used your answer.
about the singularity, right? This idea that the universe could come back to a single point, which is what the Big Bang Theory was based off of. But up until then, the dominant model had been, anybody remember? The steady state of the eternal universe. That had just always been here, and it always would be. So when this theory was proposed, atheists were up in arms. Some of them were, I wouldn't say all, but some of them were, because it pointed to a definite beginning. And to them, that was threatening, because a definite beginning pointed to a beginner. So I think it's a pretty little interesting facet of history that you may not hear about all the time, that not only do we have some issues with the Big Bang Theory in general, but atheists did at one point too. And that's part of the reason that we had to talk about, sorry, what? Did someone say something? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. That's part of the reason that we had to discuss some of those more complex theories last week, is that one of the main points of this argument we've been using, you know, everything that it begins to exist, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is that people want to get away from the fact that the universe had a beginning at all. So they're trying to stray away from this idea and get back to a model that's eternal instead of something that has a beginning at some point in time. Any other thoughts on that? Or any questions? Okay. All right, second question. As we've seen from the fine-tuning argument, remember this is the argument for design in the universe because of how everything is all set together so well for life to exist. There are so many different parameters in nature that all have to be precisely what they are. Even a difference in a fraction of a percentage in some of these would make the universe unsuitable for life, period. As we've seen from that argument, the odds of a life-supporting Earth existing or happening by chance is extremely low, extremely low. And the question is, what problems does this present for the theory of evolution, which we'll be talking about tonight?
Statistically impossible and goes against thermodynamics.
Yeah, that's true. We talked about that last week, is that mathematically it would not happen. We would need trillions and trillions and trillions of our universe over just for the chance for Earth to happen by chance to even be mathematically sensible. So the odds are so bad that you would have to reproduce what we already have several times just to be able to talk about it. So you're violating some natural laws, of course. We mentioned that too. Any other thoughts, though? Because a lot of times these things link together. A lot of these issues might have a little crossover when it comes to the finer details.
Did you cover the thermodynamics part?
I probably didn't do it well enough. I can if you'd like me to.
No. I meant to go with that.
Oh, so thermodynamics essentially, well, it's more relevant to the cause argument than it is to the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, never mind.
Because the idea of thermodynamics is if you have a certain measurable state of disorder in the universe, then that means at some point in the past you had to have an orderly state or some beginning, right? Because if it were infinite, then we'd already all been shredded to pieces by now and everything would just be dead. Or, like we talked about with the hotel example that everyone enjoyed and I feel like everyone kind of gave up on, you know, you can't have that infinite time anyway. You can't have infinite events, and thermodynamics supports that. If there were infinite energy in the universe or infinite order, then sure, we could talk about that. But since there's not, we can't. But I think it's probably more directly relevant to the first cause argument than the fine-tuning one. All right, so what is the way that we were attacking how are we using the fine-tuning argument to attack atheism or to attack these ideas? What specific avenue were we taking? We were using math, right? So what aspect of math were we using?
Anthropic principle.
Yeah, probability. We were talking about probability.
Oh.
So, you know, probability is not on the side of the universe happening by chance. The problem then with evolution is if you're going to explain the origin of life out of this, right? This does not address, the Big Bang Theory does not address life happening. Life does not come with the Big Bang or with string theory or whatever. It only explains the universe. It doesn't explain life. So life has to be explained on its own, independent of this. If the probability for life happening on its own is low, which it is, then you're compounding your chances of that happening with this. You know, like I said last week, the way you calculate a probability of something is you multiply it by all the probabilities that are involved. So if you're trying to pull a green marble out of a bag and then a yellow marble out of a bag, you multiply the odds together. Or if you're rolling dice, the same thing. Mathematically, you multiply them. And if you're getting small numbers, as you multiply them together, your numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where you get an extremely small chance of the Earth happening on its own. Therefore, when you add life into the equation, not just life supporting, but life itself, you're adding more small numbers, which means your chances get even lower. So basically, the fine-tuning argument drags down the naturalistic origin of life because it's got this massive weight of probability stacked on top of the probability that evolution has to deal with. So you're not exactly doubling, but you're basically stacking a lot of chance on top of more chance. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at with this question, is that probability is not on the side of atheism, and once you start putting these things together, it gets even worse. Does that make sense? Okay, I see a couple notes. Any questions? Any comments? All right, last question. Why do you think someone who believes in God and the Bible would be inclined to accept an old earth creationist position? Now, remember from last week, and I only got to go over this very quickly, so I'm sorry about that. But old earth creationism basically accepts what a lot of scientists say today about the age of the earth, about the age of the universe, you know, millions of years, billions of years, etc. And they normally come to this conclusion either through the gap theory in Genesis, saying that there's a huge time gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, or the day-age theory, where they say that every day of creation was actually a very large span of time. And we talked about the Hebrew word yom last week, which means a day or a period of time, and how it's used, and how to be consistent with Scripture, it has to be a 24-hour period. So why would someone take this stance, do you think? Versus reading Genesis literally.
Attempt to blend Christianity with the false science that they've heard.
Okay, so there's pressure. There's pressure on all of us, any of us, who believe in the Scriptures, to conform to the world around us. That's not surprising. We read that in Romans. And it's not just in this area, but in all areas of life. We are pressured to conform to our society's values. We're pressured to go along with what the rest of the world wants to do. And we're pressured to believe some of the things that atheists like to push and trying to justify it by calling it science. And so some people, I think, give into that pressure and try to find a way to make the two reconcile. kind of this idea of unity through not having any conflict. If I don't have to fight against it, we can just accept it all, then we'll all be better off because we're not having to fight over stuff. Any other thoughts on this? Any other answers?
God could have created the universe old.
Okay. Yeah, so even if we observe those things, we don't necessarily know at what point God created. Like we said last week, God created man mature. He created animals mature. So who's to say God didn't create the universe mature in an aged state? Of course, you can't really prove or disprove that either way, but I guess the question then is, why are you inclined to take it all the way back to one point instead of all the possible points in between? I think some people sincerely believe it. I don't think it's that people have just given up on reading the Bible. I think some people sincerely believe that the Genesis is figurative instead of literal when it talks about all these things. But I think the closer you get into studying it and the more you examine these arguments, I think that it begins to break apart and kind of fall apart on it. So, sometimes with anything else, maybe if you look into it more, you might be surprised at what you learn. Okay, any other thoughts? Any other answers? Okay. So, I hope those were good. I hope they weren't too abstract. I tried to tone it down a little bit this week because I know sometimes I kind of run off. But this week, we're talking about evolution. I titled it From Darwin to Dawkins. There's not really any special reason for that, just it was alliteration, so I thought it sounded neat. But of course we know the name Darwin, right? Charles Darwin, biologist who is credited with the majority of evolutionary theory. The Galapagos finches, the tree, all these things are attributed to him, and he's kind of the backbone of what modern atheists believe today when it comes to life in general. Dawkins, if you don't recognize that name, refers to Richard Dawkins, who is a modern day zoologist, I believe, and self-acclaimed theologian who is very staunch in his atheism. In fact, I would consider him a militant atheist, an evangelistic atheist. And he, along with some other folks of his kind, have written several books, documentaries, strongly opposing Christianity, not just proposing what they say, but attacking, sometimes fiercely, what we believe. So there's this big span from where it started to where it is now, and there are some differences that have happened over time, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. But we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. All right, so basic review real quick, very basic, as far as evolution goes. Darwinian evolution, the theory proposed by Darwin, is all about gradual change over time. It seeks to explain the variety in life around us. Why is that bird blue and that bird black? Why does that finch have that kind of beak and that finch over there have a different kind of beak? Why do several things in nature look similar, yet they're not identical? And so what Darwin was observing was, when you look around at living things, they're different. There's differences between them, but there are also similarities. One of his vehicles of change was mutation, that creatures that develop advantageous traits, who are more fit than the ones around them, are going to survive, and they're going to breed with other superior members of their species, and then they will lead to the birth of similar members of their species that also have these superior traits. And by that survival of the fittest, the weak members of the species will die out, and the superior part of the species will continue.
I would probably refer to that more as adaptation versus mutation.
There's almost kind of a line there that some people draw, and what you will hear it called, for example, if you go to apologeticspress.org and you look at a lot of their stuff, there's a line drawn between microevolution and macroevolution. And I don't know if you've heard the terms before, but micro refers to something small, macro refers to something big. The idea is the microevolution explains small changes, noticeable changes, but not drastic. Microevolution would explain why we have so many different breeds of dogs, for example, why you have a pug and a poodle and a chihuahua and a Great Dane. Obviously, they're all canines, they're all dogs, but they're very different from each other. And I think most people, at least on the apologetic side, would refer to that as microevolution because obviously there has been change. Adaptations, like you said, happen, I think. Oh, you have your hand up?
No, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm thinking with my hand up.
I'm trying to be attentive without talking too much. Macroevolution is when you get into species changing into other species. And that's kind of the line that's drawn there. When a fish is changing into an amphibian, then you've gone into macroevolution. When the amphibian turns into a reptile, when the reptile turns into a bird, that's when you're talking about macroevolution because now you're changing what the life form is at its most basic level. Its identity has changed. So that's kind of the difference, I think, that most would say between adaptation and mutation, between micro and macro. I don't have that written down tonight, but interesting about mutations is that about 99% of them are harmful. And then let's say there's a point, I'm guessing at this point, but it's probably like 0.75 or 0.8% are neutral, which means it's just like a sixth finger or something. And the other tiny little percent are beneficial. So it's easy to say mutation causes all this stuff, but when you look at the details in it, it's far more likely that a life form that mutates would die before it would be able to spread its mutation.
And there are, natural mutations that do occur.
True.
In the genetic makeup,
Oh yeah, I'm not going to say that mutations don't happen. They obviously do. I can't argue that. The question is, what role do they play, and how drastic can they get? What is their impact? And that's probably what the debate is. Can enough mutations over time change something into something drastically different than what it was through reproduction or through whatever?
I think we get more mutations as time goes on than you had at the beginning, just because of things like entropy and stuff like that, because the genetic makeup deteriorates over time, which allows more mutations. They're still not beneficial, but...
A good example of that, I think, is the English bulldog. They've been inbred so much they can't naturally reproduce anymore. Which I guess isn't necessarily a mutation in itself because it was controlled, like we did it to them. We as a human race, I didn't do it. But humans, by breeding them over and over again, eventually made them naturally sterile almost. But I think that kind of concept, maybe, is kind of what we're getting at, that idea. So that is an origin from a common ancestor. You'll hear that a lot. And if you go up to an evolutionist today and you say, I didn't come from a monkey, they're going to roll their eyes at you and blow you off because that's not necessarily what they claim. If you want to get down to the basic roots, it probably still is, but what they're going to say to you is a common ancestor, a creature that multiple species came from. And if you follow this chain far enough up the ladder, you get to an amoeba or a single cell organism, whatever it may be, that started the whole thing.
We have more DNA in common with a rat than we do a monkey.
That's true. And I think a dolphin too. I've heard that humans have like a very close match to a dolphin.
Bananas have DNA.
I'm sure they do. Anything that's alive has DNA.
I really heard that.
Now on the other side, over time, evolution has evolved, and there are now what we call neo-Darwinists. Neo meaning new. Like you've heard of probably the neo-Nazis, which is a group, and I think in America today, they're very small, thankfully, but basically trying to revive that idea. Neo-Darwinists are a little different from your classical Darwinists in that their focus is DNA, is genetics. The genetics is the vehicle through how all this happens. In classical Darwinism, they hadn't really gotten down that far yet, so Darwin's theories were more like, okay, whatever is advantageous is passed on, but we hadn't, looked at DNA as down on that level yet, so it's kind of adapted genetics into evolution. So genetics is the vehicle, not just natural selection. It's more of a population of species instead of an individual basis. That a good species will survive instead of a single organism. And I would say it's more widely accepted today, kind of like Einstein's physics is used more than Newton's physics today. Neo-Darwinian thought is kind of adding to original evolution. So evolution's had a big impact, obviously, in our world. It's had a cultural impact. It is widely accepted by your average person who maybe hasn't even studied it. And why is that? That's what they're told. Yeah, it's what they're taught. Yeah. Anyone who's been through public education has heard evolution because they had to take a biology class in high school. Now, if they looked any more into it, most people haven't. But what they heard in 7th grade is what they've taken as truth and probably haven't looked at it again since. Not everybody, but I would say a majority. Entertainment, TV, movies, the news. When the news wants an expert on someone, they call someone with a PhD. So if you have an issue, especially creation versus evolution, they're going to call up a PhD in evolutionary biology and ask his opinion. They're not going to talk to a Christian scientist. They're going to talk to a reverend or a pastor or someone who doesn't know anything about science and compare him against the PhD in biology. Apples to oranges, but it fits their narrative. TV, Discovery Channel, History Channel, movies, unfortunately even kids' movies, because it's accepted on such a basic level, they no longer have to push it or teach it, they just accept it as truth in passing conversation. A good example is you can watch your dinosaur movies, like that new dinosaur movie coming out, the kids' movie.
The Good Dinosaur.
Yeah, it's just assumed as true because at this point we're all enlightened and we all know this. And of course, politics plays a role. If you've ever been in academia, you have learned that politics and money are a huge factor in anything that goes on at a university. It's not just, the good old days of following science for the sake of science. This is no longer Newton's world. This is a business. Science is a big business, and science has a lot of money flowing around in it. And this is part of that. Evolution has an industry aspect to it. It has money backing it. And of course, it's had a religious impact as well. We talked about that a little bit already. Some wholeheartedly reject religion because of evolutionary theory, and some adapt their religion to fit it in. That's called theistic evolution. That's someone who believes in God but yet believes in evolution as God's vehicle to get us to where we are now. So some people incorporate evolution into their religion. But as I've said, most don't look at it beyond the classroom where they were told all these things. And this is why I'm about to get to why it's important. But where do you start? Because there's a ton of different topics to cover when you're talking about evolution, and we can't cover it all tonight. And even if I did a whole 13-week class on it, we still couldn't cover everything. There's a lot of different aspects to it. You could, through scientific debate, by studying yourself and studying how science works, you could talk to people on a scientific level by refuting the claims. You could observe inconsistencies in evolution with other scientific laws, like biogenesis, for example, is a very simple one, and kind of take issue on that level where you're saying, okay, this is what we accept as scientific truth, and this is what they're saying, and they don't match up. You can address foundational claims to evolution, things that it's built upon, knock out the legs from underneath it, and show that it doesn't have a leg to stand on. When it comes down to this, like I've said several times before, you need to remember your audience. You need to know who you're talking to, what their background is, where they're coming from, what they believe. And like I said, most barely remember their 7th grade biology class, and they haven't looked at it since. And they have been exposed to this media just like we have, that's reiterating these ideas. It's just accepted as truth. You're a reasonable person, therefore you believe it, and they don't really go any farther into it. So what we're going to do tonight, in the time we have left, is look at 3 shaky icons of evolution. Now, I bring this out because I think it's A, it's simple, I think B, we can relate to it because most of us have seen it before, and C, I've got a book to recommend on this. And I actually haven't gotten to read the entire thing yet, but the book is called Icons of Evolution, and it's by a man named Jonathan Wells. And what he did was he took 20 not 3, but 20 of these evolutionary icons, these ideas or concepts, and he examines them for what they are. He goes and he looks into the history of these things and what actually went on, and what you're not told in high school. So the first one, the Miller-Urey experiment. Basically, it sought to do an experiment on the origin of life. It was in the 1950s, and the idea was to simulate the early atmosphere of the Earth. Okay, so how did life begin? So what they did was they set up what they thought the early Earth was like so that they could try to create life out of a primordial soup or whatever it may be. So they basically had go away. They had this little mixture of chemicals that they thought was on the Earth at the time, and they introduced electricity to simulate lightning, electrical shock. So the idea is lightning strikes the chemicals, it creates organic material, and life arises. The miracle happens. And their experiment formed some amino acids. And what amino acids are they are the building blocks of proteins, which proteins are the building blocks of DNA. So what they said is, hey, there it is. We've formed the basic building blocks from our naturalistic experiment, no God required. So the conclusion was, we've created life from non-living material. They call it abiogenesis. They claim that proteins could be created from this chemical soup. I give everybody a minute to write down. I speak too quickly.
So they're making an assumption, first of all, on what the quote-unquote chemical soup was.
What was present?
Life,
Yeah.
you know, and so, I mean, that, which all experiments, you have assumptions, but still,
Right.
I mean,
Since they weren't there, they have to, guess what they thought it might be like. So there's a couple of problems here. First of all, they got it wrong. They got the incorrect atmosphere, according to most scientists today. The issue is they didn't have any oxygen in their atmosphere, no O2. Have you ever seen something that metal that's rusted over? It's exposure to oxygen. Oxygen is not friendly to a lot of materials. So what happened was, once they introduced the oxygen, it oxidized the amino acids, neutralizing them. Basically, you've created life, and then the environment kills it. So you might have life for a split second, but then the atmosphere that they think would have happened now would have eaten it up almost instantaneously. Not only that, you don't have enough to build off of those amino acids. You would have to have a whole lot more than that to combine them. You have to have some mechanism to form the amino acids in the right way to form the proteins. Then you have to have something to form the proteins in the right way to make DNA. You've got a lot of steps, even if this was valid, that you've got to jump to still get to life. And then you got the Humpty Dumpty issue, which kind of goes along with the insufficiency that I wrote. Because if you got a soup, well then you might have what you need here, and there, and there, and here, but how do you mesh it together into a cell? If you've ever studied the cell, it's incredible. It is a biological factory on a scale that we have just recently, relatively speaking, been able to observe. And it repairs itself, it functions on its own. If it gets damaged, it keeps on working in a different way while it repairs itself. And all of this, how do you organize that on its own? Even if you could have gotten to that point. There's so many steps that you still have to take, even if this was a good experiment, to get to that point. So, in reality, this was abandoned by scientists a long time ago. If you talk to most evolutionary biologists today, they'll tell you that the experiment wasn't good, yet they still put it in the textbooks. Because it's convenient, and because, well, I guess because they can. Money, textbooks. Alright, second one. Haeckel's embryos. Anyone heard of this one before? You heard of this one before. Okay, so Hegel sought to show the similarity of life forms in their early developmental stages, embryos. Basically, the theory was that the embryo will replay the steps of evolution as it's developing into a baby or into a puppy or whatever it may be. So fish, birds, reptiles, mammals, all of these, he took pictures of these together and showed their similarities and presented that as evidence for evolution. And this is still in the science textbooks as far as I understand, and he proposed it in like the 1850s or 60s. And so the conclusion was, since all these embryos are so similar, since they follow these steps, they must have a common ancestor from which they all arise. He pointed to supposed gill slits on the different embryos, the fact they all had tails, you know, all these similarities. Now, again, there's a couple of problems here. So there's a picture, first of all. This is to get an idea of what I'm talking about here. So you see, you got a fish on this end, you have a salamander, tortoise, chicken, hog, calf, rabbit, and a man. And now look at the top row. It's remarkably similar, very similar. And in the middle row, you start to see them change, and then in the bottom row, you have, you know, fully formed or almost fully formed life forms. Couple of problems. First of all, the similarities were faked. And I don't mean that he made a small mistake. I mean, he literally went and faked them. Some of these embryo pictures, he actually went to the wood cutting of the carving that he made these from, and instead of making ones for each one, he was so confident or arrogant in his conclusions that he just reused them. He reused these pictures. So like, for example, I don't know which ones he did, but for example, the fish. Let's say he just reused the fish for the salamander instead of actually going and seeing what a salamander embryo looks like. So he literally faked the entire thing. Some embryos came from the same pictures. Not only that, he cherry-picked his examples. And this is interesting. So there are 3 types of mammals in scientific classification. You have what most mammals are. I forget the name of it. I'm sorry. Then you have marsupials, and you have monotremes. And you guys might remember when I was a kid talking about these. Marsupials are your kangaroos, your koalas, all that kind of stuff. Monotremes are platypus. Have you seen platypus before? Echidnas, mammals that lay eggs. He only used one type of mammal, even though he had like 4 or 5 mammals up there. Monotremes and marsupials look very different, extremely different at these early stages. He also cherry-picked a salamander over a frog. Frog looks very different at the early stages than a salamander does, even though they're both amphibians. And a third major problem with his pictures is that he did not show embryos in their early stage. He showed them at their midpoint stage. So essentially, they start out looking very different at their early stage, which is what Darwin was hoping they would look similar. At their midpoint stage, they start to look a little similar, and then at their late stage in their development, they go back to looking very different. So not only did he fake some of his information, he falsified the entire claim from the beginning. He subverted what Darwin had said, and again, he cherry-picked his results. He was accused of fraud by his colleagues in the 1860s. 150 years later, and these are still in our textbooks. Why? Because there's money in textbooks, and because no one's making them take them out. But if you talk to scientists, they will tell you that this is all bupkis, that it's all useless, because it's been disproven long ago. All right, last one. Darwin's tree of life, and I kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. Basically, what Darwin said is for his theory to be correct, of species turning into more species, you have to start, say how do you do it? Hit it this way. You have to start with a common ancestor. And that common ancestor, different individuals will have different traits, and they'll turn into these different forms, and then they'll branch off into different forms as they move off and as they live in different environments, and et cetera, you get this big tree, big branches of trees. So it's basically a roadmap of how species would form, how the variations would happen. He showed a bunch of species coming out from one point that branched out And his idea was this illustrates your natural selection process. So therefore his claim was that all life came down to this point, whatever that point may be, and that the fossil record would provide the missing links that weren't available when he threw this out, when he suggested it. So, again, there are a couple of issues with this. First problem, or actually the main problem, is the fossil record not only does not support his claim, it shows the exact opposite of his claim. Remember, the whole idea is you're starting here and you're ending up here, millions of years going on, at least millions of years. So it's supposed to take a very long, gradual time for things to change very slightly, and over time those changes can be observed as major differences. There's this thing called the Cambrian explosion. It's a reference to a phenomenon that has been observed in the fossil record, where you've got simple little life forms and you have complex life forms side by side each other in the fossil record. You have complex, you have simple, and you have all this big mix of species in what geologists would call a relatively short period of time, according to them. That they're all in these rock layers very close to each other. They don't support the idea that a long length of time happened between them because they're sitting beside each other effectively. So you have a dramatic variety of life in a relatively short period of time, and that is directly contradicting what Darwin was hoping would happen to prove his theory true. No missing links, no non-hoax missing links have been found up to this point to verify this idea. And of course, every 5 years or so, you'll hear them say there's been a missing link found, and then you hear a couple weeks later, or you don't because they don't talk about it, that it was premature and they found a monkey with, I don't know, that would have been really clever if I could remember what it's called. Scoliosis, or something like that. Some strange, twist on something that already exists that they thought was an early human. Even Darwin admitted this problem would kill his theory, that this would be a huge issue if this was not supported. And we see it's not. Unless we're going to find some layer of Earth that we haven't already looked at and shows the exact opposite of what everywhere else shows, we're not going to find it. So as the days go on, and as more scientific discoveries are made when it comes to paleontology, this gets less and less likely because there's more and more proof stacked up against it for it to happen. All right, so those are 3 issues I wanted to bring to you tonight. Obviously, like I said, there are a lot more, and I would suggest that book. If you want to talk to me about it after class, I can show you my reference here. I'd also suggest this book, Case for Creator by Lee Strobel. It's a really good book. It provides some apologetic ideas, gives a little bit of a scientific background for them from a whole lot of different areas of study. So we have 3 questions next week. Read some Genesis, think about some hands, and think about the Cambrian explosion. Thank you guys.
You got your slides on.
Yeah.